Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crown Gray's Cocon. Let's get into the video. In today's video, we're going to be talking about communism. We're going to be continuing our political theories series and talk about the idea itself. We're going to be talking about some of its history, the great thinkers about it, and yeah, so let's get straight into the video. But before we do all that, you know what time it is. You need to subscribe, you need to like. If you have anything interesting to say, like kind of any questions, please put it in the comment section. Share it with your friends and family, anyone who might be interested, and really helps out the channel. So definitely, help me to help you. I'm helping you guys, teaching you guys lots of different things about political theories and series and so yeah. Help me out. Right, so communism is defined as all property and the means of production being held in common by the community. Yeah? So everyone contributes what they're able to contribute, everyone receives what they need to receive. So as Marx said in his Communist Manifesto, he said, to each according to his ability, to each according to his need, right? So for instance, I have the ability to make somewhat decent YouTube videos, but I do really need a haircut. So what you need to do is like and subscribe, share the wealth. That way I'm able to get a bit of money to get a haircut. Actually, I can afford a haircut anyway, I'm just being lazy. But you see what I'm saying? So that's the I'm not sure whether a haircut is like a actual human right, like a need as such. But either way, it will help me out a little bit. But anyway, so now it's quite interesting if one looks at like where humans kind of came from and stuff, yeah, in terms of like evolution, in evolutionary terms. Because if we look at like our two closest living relatives now, we have the chimpanzees, right, and we have the bonobos, right. So we'll probably go into a future video on this, yeah, like in terms of the complexities of their different societies, yeah. But the bonobos have a very egalitarian, like hippie, like free love, all that kind of stuff, yeah, like kind of very strange animals, yeah, right. And they're separated by a river, yeah, I believe the Congo River, like kind of, it may be that specific one, but either way, it's a big river, so I'm assuming, from what I've heard, it's the Congo, right? Anyway, so on one side you've got the bonobos, on the other side you have the chimps, right? Chimps are the exact opposite. They're very violent, they're very territorial, they're very hierarchical, right? And there's dominance and there's war and everything here, right? So the way to kind of think of human beings is kind of a weird amalgamation of these two kind of species, yeah, like kind of, and like our mindset is sometimes we could be kind of like free lovey, hippie kind of, and sometimes we could be very warlike and hierarchical. But it's quite strange, like if one looks at how early humans kind of survived and stuff, right? And how hunter-gatherers kind of survive today, those sort of societies are what one could refer to as primitive communism. So what that means is everyone in that little society of about maybe 30 to 100 people, right? They all have their own little role and stuff, but there's not really dominant hierarchy at all. Everyone just goes out. Some people pick berries, some people do hunting, some people do this, you know what I mean? So it's everyone's kind of looking out for each other. It's almost like an extended family. Everyone's kind of looking out for each other, right? There's no, and the children looked after by everyone in the village, and like anyone can have anyone's kind of wife or whatever. There's no sort of property, like no one. It's almost a bit like in Huxley's book, and A Brand New World, where everyone is kind of owned by everyone and everything is owned by everyone, right? And now, when humans kind of started to change from that was when you started to have agriculture, right? Because with agriculture, you go, right, these are my sheep, these are my cows, these are my chickens, right? So they're mine, right? To go through the effort of actually looking after them and stuff, certain things can't be owned in common, right? So this is what's referred to as the tragedy of the commons, where if everyone owns something, then nobody owns it, right? So no one has an incentive to look after it. It takes a lot of effort to look after animals, and if only some people are looking after them and going through all the effort, and everyone else is just not doing that, yeah, then it's a thing of, well, like, no one really has an incentive to really look after them. And the same way with land, right, with like agricultural land. If I'm growing crops, this has to be my section where I'm growing my crops, right, and I'm receiving the benefits from it. Because if it's everyone's crops, then only some people are gonna look after it. Some people are really hardworking, very ingenuitive, like kind of innovative as well, like kind of like. Whereas some people are just gonna be lazy and just be like, yeah. So part of the problem with that is, as you start to have more of a kind of developed society, you end up having to have some sort of division of labour and some sort of private property, because then there's an incentive for people to actually say, this is mine and I'm receiving the fruits from my labour. So, this is what one could almost refer to as the kind of beginning of private property, and you start seeing, the nuclear family start to develop as well. We start to see people being like, right, these are my children, this is my wife, etc., right? And so the whole kind of concept of common ownership starts to really break down, and it becomes more atomized and more like individualized, right? So many people who advocate for communism, look at this as the kind of the first time when society, human nature kind of begins to change. And this ties in with what Rousseau said about man is born free but everywhere in chains. So his thinking was that in a state of nature, human beings are free and they can do what they want, and and Rousseau said that something along the lines of like the greatest evil was done when the first person set up a little picket fence around their thing and said, this is my land, right? And he said that everyone else at that moment should have like torn that picket fence like kind of apart, and then so the problem with all this though is that it becomes very, very difficult to build any sort of advanced economy and stuff, right? And it's difficult to generate wealth because of this tragedy of the commons. Because of this, there's no incentive for people to actually do things, right? So there's the theoretical side, and we're gonna look more into, well, both the theory of it as it developed over the centuries, but also the practical side of communism and its results. So these ideas are not necessarily new in the sense of people have been thinking about this kind of concept for a long time. Yeah, this kind of like this utopian like worldview and stuff, right? So as early as the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, right, he advocated that all wives, all children, all property should be held in common, right, and should be ruled by like philosopher kings as such, like wise men who would kind of lead society in a way, but like they would be there because of competence, because of their reasoning abilities and stuff, right, and their ability to organize society, not through a thing of becoming wealthy or becoming powerful, but just for the kind of greater good and stuff, right? So fast forward a few like millennia, you have the teachings of Thomas More, right? So in his book from 1516 called Utopia, he spoke about how by looking at the teachings of Jesus, he said, in terms of like basically get rid of all your wealth, like kind of like everyone should just live like equally, everyone should like give unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, what kind of stuff, like the rich man, like it's easier for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, like all these sort of things, right? So people like early kind of like Christians often made that kind of argument that actually having a more egalitarian society is more in keeping with the teachings of Jesus. And so if one wanted to move more towards more biblical like teaching of the Bible and try and set up society in that way, they would have to go back to a system where there is no private property, where there's no money, where we all kind of just live equally and peacefully together. And with the Reformation, you start to see more and more radical groups taking hold of these sort of ideas. You start to see the diggers in England, and you start to see the Puritans, right? And again, these people kind of argue for sort of proto-communism, right? So we see this with the modern day Amish community, where everyone in the community works and they all cooperate together, and it's almost like a commune, right? And there's many examples of this around the world today as well. In Israel, in the kibbutz, people, everyone looks after everyone looks after all the children, there's no private property, people work together collectively, right? So on a small scale, within the community of like-minded people, where people are voluntarily coming together in this way, where people have the same goals, they might be from the same family or same groups of family and stuff, this proposition can work to a degree. Although part of the reason why the Puritans, when they came to America, part of the reason why their property, why their kind of colonies, their settlements kind of struggled at the very beginning, was that while they had like a strong work ethic, it also meant that there wasn't much wealth being created and stuff. So actually, we talk much about the Puritans' lands in America on like Plymouth Rock, but the reality is that many of the people who came over and actually helped build America were people who came there for financial reasons, whether it was in the fishing industry or in this or that, agriculture, whether it was like corn, whether it was further down south, obviously you had like slave economies, for tobacco and cotton and all the rest of it, right? So a big reason why America was actually put together in the way that it was for financial gain and stuff. People didn't cross an ocean some people were across an ocean like the Puritans to try and set up this kind of new world, like this new utopia, but in reality most of the pull came from people wanting to have a better life for themselves and their family, and to have property, to be wealthy, etc. So again, we have to really think about in practical terms, the economic viability of these kind of communal societies. So now we're going to skip forward a little bit to 1848. 1848 is a really, really decisive year on the continent of Europe. It's the time of revolutions in nearly all of the major countries there. And while all of those revolutions were crushed, the atmosphere in the air really had long-lasting effects on the whole of European history from that moment on, right? So in the heat of that moment, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels came together and wrote the Communist Manifesto, along with other books that they wrote at a later stage, right? And basically what this was arguing was that history was just about class struggle. So what Marx and Engels said was that societies started off with primitive communism, then they became feudal, then so feudalism is obviously like kings and lords and knights and everything, and they rule society, and everyone's peasants, so everyone living in a kind of everyone's basically a serf, and they have to pay taxes and have to pay tribute and everything to their overlords, right? And then from there you have capitalism. This is when people are able to have private property and they become wealthy. There's entrepreneurs, etc. But you end up having two sets of classes, right? So in the feudal society, it was the nobility versus the peasantry. In a capitalist society, it's the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, right? The bourgeoisie are the capitalists, right? Are the wealthy people. The proletariat are the workers, right? So the clash between kind of factory owners, one could think of, and factory workers, just an example, this is the kind of key thing, right? And Marx believed that while capitalism was the greatest economic innovator of all time, he said that it also led to great levels of inequality, and that eventually capitalism would collapse in on itself, and the proletariat, right, would have a revolution, right, and install a dictatorship of the proletariat. So a government run for, by, and of the workers, right, and they would, crush the bourgeoisie class, and then we'd have socialism, right? Socialist society would be, as we discussed in the last video, so definitely check that out if you haven't already. We're in a socialist society. Everything would be held in common. The government, would be controlling everything. Like everything would be, everyone would work for the state. Everything would be in the state, etc., etc. And then once we'd, achieved all of the goals from socialism, then the idea was that the state would dissolve, and then we would be at this final utopian end goal of communism, right? So this was what Marx argued, that the proletariat, the industrial workers in the industrialized West, in places like Britain and Germany, etc., they need to rise up to overthrow the old capitalist world order, and they need to set up socialist regimes which would eventually lead to a worldwide revolution and then communism, right? So no more borders, no more anything, right? No more religion, no nothing, right? It almost sounds like a John Lennon song, right? Everything gone, and a new utopia, a new Garden of Eden kind of rising in its place. So that was the thought of Marx and stuff, right? And over time, these ideas became more and more popular. We spoke last time about the Paris Commune of 1871, where revolutionaries tried out this idea, but it was crushed very quickly by the after the space of a few weeks by the French military. So the first time it was kind of tested, it kind of got snuffed out at a very early stage, right? But as time went on, and in Marx's later years, he started to look at Russia, right? Russia was a vast empire. It was a land where, the Tsars ruled, the emperor, ruled, and most of the population were peasants, very, very poor, and they'd only just started to industrialize in the towns and cities, right? And he said that actually somewhere like Russia could, in theory, skip a stage, right? Didn't necessarily need to be fully industrialized. It already had enough tensions, and there was enough of a kind of revolutionary fervor there to be able to stir up things and actually have this revolution in there, right? So now we have to start talking about the run-up to the Russian Revolution, or rather the Bolshevik Revolution, the October Revolution of 1917. So in 1881, we have Tsar Alexander III being assassinated, right? Not Alexander III, Alexander II. He's assassinated by some revolutionaries, right? He was about to bring even more reforms to the people of Russia and set up a parliament and etc., etc. But tragically, on his way to passing this bill, he was blown up by some revolutionaries. His son, Alexander III, was incredibly ruthless in cracking down on that, because obviously he wanted revenge for what happened to his father. One of the people who were hanged by this was the older brother of someone called Vladimir Lenin. He was a young boy at this time. Young Vladimir, at seeing the murder of his, the execution of his brother, also became a fervent revolutionary. And so Lenin ended up becoming the leader of the Bolshevik party, right? So the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, right? So in Russian, Bolshevik derives from the word meaning Bolshi, like big, i.e. the majority, and then you had the Mensheviks, who were seen as the minority, right? So the argument was amongst communist people in Russia at the time was The Mensheviks were saying, no, we're not ready yet for a revolution, we have to wait for Russia to industrialize first. The Bolsheviks, who made up the majority, said, no, we can skip this stage. We can take Russia by force, and we can industrialize it that way, and so we have it as like a holding action. Yeah. So while we have Russia, other places like Germany and Britain, other industrialized places, they can rise up with communism as well. So they kind of wanted to jump ahead of the curve and kind of kickstart the worldwide revolution in Russia, even though in theory Russia was nowhere near industrialized enough. It was nowhere near enough of a proletariat society in order to be able to do that. So in the wake of World War One, so again, as we said last time, there was a division between the people who were on the left, who were in favour of the war, and the people who were against the war. And as time went on, within the instabilities of Russia, due to the inadequacies of their military and the poor leadership of Tsar Nicholas II, you end up having the February Revolution that overthrew that old order. But the socialists who had taken over the government still wanted to continue the war. And it's a very unpopular war, and many people had died, and the people were crying out for land, bread, and peace. I think I've got that in the wrong order, but those are the three. So, peace, land, and bread, that was it. So guess what Lenin comes and offers when he returns from exile? Peace, land, and bread. So ends up getting quite a lot of traction, quite a lot of positive support. But in the first and last free and democratic elections that Russia would have for a long time, in that only election, in that first election, the Bolsheviks came second, right? They got about maybe a quarter of the votes, right? So nowhere near getting a majority. However, they happen to have the majority of the soldiers and the sailors, and a good proportion of the industrialized workers in the cities, right? And so while the majority of the population who were peasants supported the social revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks had all the key elements that you need to have a coup, right? And so in October of 1917, what they did is they enacted what some people have referred to as a revolution, but really it was a very tactical coup. And they went straight to the key parts of the state apparatus that need to be taken over, and very quickly, in the space of a night or two, they took over the whole main structure of Russia. So this kick-started the Russian Civil War. Again, a very bloody conflict that drew all the powers of the world in there, because as Winston Churchill said, we need to strangle communism in its cradle, right? The revolution has started. We need to strangle it right here before it's able to grow up into anything bigger, right? But because of the incompetencies of the White Army, because of the war weariness of the Allied powers, who retreated and stuff, the communists end up winning in Russia. And then we had the establishment of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, the Soviet Union. But now, with this revolution taking place, right, we now had, as we said in the last video, we said about the First International, the Second International. Now in 1919, we had the Third International. And this was led by Lenin, and this was a call to all communist parties throughout the world that now is the time to set up revolutions in your own countries, right? And we saw this with the Spartacus uprising in 1919 in Germany. We saw this with many uprisings throughout the rest of the world, and all of these movements ended up being crushed by different forces, right? But again, it set a bit of a precedent, right? So within the Communist Party, we had two sets of debates. And these debates intensified with the death of Lenin in 1924, right? Because there was a power struggle, because he hadn't named a clear successor. Now, the leader of the Red Army during this time was Leon Trotsky. The person who was the chairman of the party was Joseph Stalin. These two men had two different ideas. Leon Trotsky advocated for world revolution. He advocated for starting revolutions, invading places all around the world, aiding communist parties and organizations throughout the world to kickstart the world revolution. Joseph Stalin said that Russia was weak, was that it was in danger of being invaded once again, that it needed to catch up militarily with the West in the space of 10, it needed to close the gap of 100 years, or of 50 to 100 years in the space of 10 years, right? And this required mass industrialization. This needed not world revolution, but socialism in one country. And so the debate between these two men and the clever, malevolent undertakings of Stalin ended up with Trotsky getting booted out, and eventually he was exiled and ended up in 1940 with a ice pick through the head by one of Stalin's assassins. But anyway, Stalin ended up becoming the supreme premier of the USSR, and we estimate about 20 million people died under him. The Holodomor in Ukraine in the period of 1932 to 33 was a period where the peasants in Ukraine were purposely had their food taken away from them and were purposely starved to death, to kind of teach them a lesson and stuff. And many other things. There were purges, executions, an era of terror and mass just death and fear and a cult of personality where everyone had to almost basically worship Stalin, the great leader. And this ended up with people being very outside of the Soviet Union. There was now a split between communists, right? There were those who decried what Stalin did, right, and saying this is not real communism, you're perverting things for your own ends. And then there were the ardent Stalinists, who were in support of everything that he was doing and everything the Soviet Union was becoming. So we see this again in multiple different schisms, and we see this in the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 39, where the different Republican groups who were fighting Franco spent more time fighting each other. And so Franco ends up taking over and ends up creating a fascist state in Spain, right? And so, and when we have the Third International, which is pushed by Trotsky and stuff, it's not seen as legitimate by Stalin, right? So it's completely ignored. And having this fear of communism looming over Europe in that time meant that Nazi Germany, Hitler, was able to rise from the ashes of things, because people were so scared of this communist threat that they thought, actually, let's do a deal with fascists, let's have them as a bulwark between us and them, right? And this paranoia, this fear, ended up with the rise of Nazi Germany, with World War II, and Hitler invading the Soviet Union because he believed it to be a country run by Jews and Bolsheviks and stuff, right? So the Soviet Union ended up losing 13% of its population in this war. It's the equivalent of, if you live in England, it's the equivalent of all the people of London being killed, and probably an area stretching from the south coast probably to Birmingham being destroyed, right? It was a devastating war. So did this kind of ease up Stalin a bit? No. He used the war and the gains that he had made to expand communism into Eastern Europe, and then with all that, we end up having like in like the East, we end up having the fall of China to communism. We end up having North Korea, we end up having North Vietnam. Before we knew it, we were entering into a Cold War. Now, two things. First of all, I need to correct the fact that I said a third international. Yeah, like kind of with like that with the Trots did. What I meant by that is the fourth international, which was 1938, which the Trotskyites were like set up. So anyway, that was a little minor correction. And the second thing I was going to say was this: there's been debates within the kind of communist movement and stuff as to whether this was real communism, right? So people look at what Karl Marx was saying. He was advocating for a dictatorship of the proletariat. He was advocating for class conflict. He was advocating for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie. Now, if you're advocating for a violent revolution and you end up taking control of a country and you're seizing the means of production, how do you go about doing that if people do not voluntarily give up their private property? It necessitates you having to use force. So if we have the full apparatus of the state in a dictatorship where there is no free speech, there are no free elections, there's no free press, if we have a situation like that, we have the full force of the military and the secret police and everything, right? Surely the logical conclusion of that is that anyone who dissents, anyone who stands in the way of setting up your utopia has to be crushed. So when we talk about 20 million dead in the Soviet Union, 50 million dead in Maoist China, yeah, and millions more dead in all the other communist places, we have to really ask ourselves, at what point is the theory lined up with the reality? Because if in theory you're advocating for revolution, for violent revolution, surely the final outcome, and every single place it's been tried, it's had the same outcome. Surely the two things must be intertwined. Surely it can't be just coincidence that every single time they tried to do communism, it's always ended up being perverted by people. Surely we have to pay the devil his due and assume that people say what it is that they mean, like, you know, they what they say, let's take them at their word, right? Let's say that they're trying to implement communism, so they're going by it in the same means. And for those who argue that actually it could be implemented in different ways, yeah, chances are that if it's like what Lord Acton said about power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The inherent problem with having any sort of dictatorship, whether it's the proletariat or the bourgeoisie or whoever it is, yeah, is that you have too much power concentrated in the hands of too few people. And even if your intentions are good, very quickly someone with nefarious intentions, someone with ill intent, is going to rise up to the top. So even if we assume that Lenin or Trotsky were angels, and there's no evidence to suggest they were, the Gulag system began under them. So we can't. So even if we assume that they were complete angels, it's not. Once you have all that power concentrated in the hands of so few people, it's going to be inevitable that the most ruthless person is going to rise to the top of that and is going to, make the most of the system that you've created. So when we talk about was it real communism or was it not real communism, we have to really ask ourselves, what would real communism actually look like? And how would you actually go about doing it in a way that's non-coercive. If you have a kulak, if you have like a wealthy peasant who says, no, you're not taking my land, you're not going to collectivise my land, you're not taking my money, you're not doing that, how are you going to deal with him other than throw him in a gulag? How are you going to deal with him other than rounding him up and shooting him? How would any of this have happened in any other way? And I'd be very interested in the comment section to hear what people suggest was the alternative in their utopian analysis of this. But we do have to pay the devil his due. During Soviet times, during communist times rather, in all the different places where it was tried, we saw a lot of money going into education, into healthcare, into housing, into employment for people who, up until that point, had just been illiterate peasants living hand to mouth and stuff, right? So, at bare minimum, what we can say is that actually life for ordinary people in communist societies were, in some ways, better than life had been before these things, right? So, and also let's not forget that most places that have had communism, in fact nearly all places that have communism, have all been dictatorships, before they were communists, right? With very, very few exceptions. So if all you've known is tyranny, if all you've known is poverty, or if all you've known is illiteracy and lack of access to healthcare and lack of housing, etc., and all of a sudden now at least you have the bare necessities in life taken care of, then it's quite easy to see why many people who come from places like Cuba or come from like the former Soviet Union, etc., how many of them will still say, you know what, things were bad, but at least we had this and that and that and that, whereas now we don't have that. And part of the dynamic with communism is that from an economic standpoint, if everything is centralized within the state, then the amount of like efficiency really does begin to like decrease over time, because there's no incentive for people to work harder if they're not going to get paid any extra. If there's no, like, if you're running a factory and you're only getting paid a little tiny bit more than the people working on the factory floor, then why go through the effort of trying to innovate? Well, you're not going to become a millionaire, you're not going to become a billionaire. So innovation ends up being stifled. The entire economy slowly decays and begins to stagnate. And so this is what you start to see in the Soviet bloc in the 70s and 80s, right? And so this culminates in 1989 to 91 with the collapse of, first of all, of the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe, with country after country like freeing themselves from Soviet domination, and then in 1991 the collapse of the USSR. And there are still countries today which are on paper communist, right? But China, for instance, is still run in theory by the Chinese by communism, even though they've adopted free market economics. The same thing can be said for Vietnam. Again, the Communist Party there also still runs things, but has adopted capitalist economic models. So the only two places that have maintained a certain level of this communist economic policy are North Korea and Cuba, right? So if we compare what life has been like in South Korea with what is in North Korea, it's a stark difference, right? People in South Korea earn way more than people in North Korea, okay? People in Cuba over the last 60 years has lost 1 million people fleeing to the United States, right? A little rubber dinghy rapids. I said rubber dinghy rapids. I got that from Four Lions. Wow, rubber dinghy rapids. Hold on now. On little rubber dinghies. There's no rubber dinghy rapids yet. If you haven't seen Four Lions, go watch it. Yeah, like that's what I got in my head. But on little rubber dinghies, right? Crossing 90 miles of shark-infested waters, in order to get a better life. People flee communist countries for capitalist countries. People do not flee capitalist countries to go to communist countries, right? If you're losing almost 10% of your population to like this exodus to a capitalist country, right? How good is your system, right? And yes, people in Cuba do have excellent access to healthcare. But at the same time, if you're a doctor in Cuba, you make more money moonlighting as a taxi driver or as a doorman than you do from your actual profession. So yes, they've got more doctors per GDP they've got more doctors per capita than any other place on earth. But even still, in Cuba, things are obviously not great if so many people are leaving. And also, what we have to really think about is this. Why would it be necessarily beneficial to live under a communist society? Why would it necessarily be good to have everything exactly equal? Because we all know that people have different talents, that people strive to do different things, right? And some of those things take extra time, take extra levels of skill, doing things that other people cannot do, like whether it being an athlete or being a doctor or this and other, there should be rewards for that extra effort. And in communist societies where everybody, regardless of whether you're a cleaner or whether you're this, right, there's nothing wrong with any of those jobs. But the thing is, having a society where everyone is made to be equal stifles innovation, stifles creativity. And if you have any criticisms of that, with no free press, no anything, right, then it's, you're trapped. And it doesn't matter whether like that prison that you're living in has excellent healthcare, has excellent education, has all these things, At the end of the day, if you cannot be whatever it is you want to be, if you can't strive to reach the heights that you want to, if you can't even criticize the state in which you live in, and you can't vote them out of office, well then how free, like what is the purpose in that? You literally, as we say, you're living in a gilded cage. And so this is something that we have to really think about, in the sense of, just because communism collapsed in the Eastern Bloc in the early 90s, these ideas are not going away. These ideas are still propagated by many, many people who criticize capitalism, who believe that the flaws in the system are so inherent that they need to be overthrown. But the thing is, I would urge a word of caution to that, because it's one thing to upend society, it's one thing to advocate revolution, but the word revolution comes from the word to revolve, i.e. to go in a circle. You overthrow the Tsar, you end up with a red Tsar. You overthrow, the people in China, you end up with someone worse. You overthrow Batista, you end up with Castro, right? So in all these cases, if you overthrow the system you had before and try to set up something new, before you know it, you will end up with much of the system that you had before, and all the power will be concentrated into the hands of a very small, ideologically like fanatic group of people who have not learnt from the lessons of history, and they are either naive or arrogant enough to believe that how they would implement communism would be different from every other time. They believe that they've learnt from the lessons of history, but the lessons of history show that actually it's not likely to happen. And another thing that many people who are communists fail to recognise is this: every single time a communist revolution has succeeded, it has been in a society that has been predominantly agricultural, and not fully industrialised yet. In every single state that was industrialised enough, whether it's Germany, Italy, Spain, Chile, etc., when you try to implement communism, the bourgeoisie within that state have enough strength, and there's enough people in there who have private property, who have a vested interest in maintaining in maintaining the kind of capitalist society, that actually, if you push them to that extreme, they will push the other way in the opposite extreme. And this is how you get the rise of fascism. So in developed industrialized capitalist nations, if you try to implement communism, if there's a rise in communism, it has always had the equal and opposite rise of fascism in its place. And so those who advocate for communist revolution within Britain or America have to recognize that the lessons of history is that any time this has been tried to be implemented in a developed country, it's always led to the rise of fascism. And this is something that we have to be very wary of, and it's also something we're going to talk about in the next video. But this is me wrapping up with the section on communism. There are obviously some benefits to it. There is the focus of helping those who are least fortunate. At the same time, there's a lot of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There's a lot of criticism of the inherent problems with capitalism, but many of the solutions end up being worse than the cure. And so this is something that we always have to bear in mind, that within a liberal democratic society, people can and should be free to exercise and their views and to believe in whatever it is they want to within the marketplace of ideas. But in reality, within it's communism goes against the very nature of that liberal democracy. It cannot exist within the confines of that society. It seeks to overthrow that. And if you're going to overthrow the system which has provided the most freedom, the most economic prosperity, and the best standard of living for both rich and poor out of any system that has ever existed, you're going to have to be very, very careful that if you are to implement communism, that somehow this time it's going to be different. So with that said, thank you for watching another one of my videos. There are a link in the description for other things that you can look at this, and yeah, check out my other channels that talk about the different all the other different political theories. Stay tuned. Like I said, next week we're going to be talking about fascism and like the history of that, and we're going to be looking at many other theories as well. And yeah, so if you enjoyed this, like I said at the beginning, subscribe, like, write some comments. I think the comment section from this section might be a bit dicey from this video, but yeah, like I'm more than willing to receive it. And in the meantime, have a great day. Bye.